We are beginning to study statistics. So the natural first questions are, of course, what is statistics and what are some of the key terms of vocabulary that we're going to need. So first of all, statistics is the study of how to collect, organize, analyze, and interpret numerical information. For a long time, the key to statistics was getting the data. And then knowing what to do with it. These days, statistics is becoming more and more important, not because the data is scarce and you need statisticians to go get it, but in fact the opposite. There's now just a tidal wave of data because of all the computer connectivity we have. In fact, governments and agencies are being crushed by the volume of data being produced, and we need statisticians who can effectively summarize, analyze, and weed through this huge amount of data which is being generated. So the next step is figuring out what are some of the key terms. When we want to study anything really, for example, we could study the students here at this school. Well, what we have is we have the individual or individuals versus variables. Right? And we need to be able to distinguish between the two. When we talk about, we're going to study the students here at the school, well, we're talking about the individuals, right? The variable is, what are we going to study about these students? Some examples could be height, hair color, age, nationality. These are all attributes of the individuals. So we have to distinguish between, the variable and the individual. The variable is just one part of the individual. Now, when we talk about variables, right, there are really two kinds of variables. Quantitative variables versus qualitative variables. We can use the previous list of variables. If we look back, some of these are quantitative and some of these are qualitative. And the difference is really, are they numbers or are they categories? Height, for example, is a number. That would be quantitative. Hair color, however, is a quality, so that's a qualitative. Age is a number, quantitative. Nationality is qualitative. Like this, and it's important to distinguish between the two because we can do different things with different analyses depending on the type of variable it is. Age, we could average, for example. It's hard to average nationality or hair color. Now, once you've identified, the individuals, you've identified the variables, you've figured out whether it's a quantitative or qualitative variable. All right, the next issue here is population versus sample. When we talk about population, we're talking about all or every member. Every individual of interest, it's called. An individual is a generic term, talking about the students at the school. We're talking about people. We could talk about, apple trees, and those are, each tree is an individual. So it's both human and non-human. We could be talking about rock samples, and so animate, inanimate. It's just every individual member of the population. Now, sometimes we can measure the entire population. For example, if we talked about the students at the school, we could probably survey every single student and get the entire population. Sometimes you can't. If we are talking about every human on the planet as our population, then it's a little hard to get all of the data. So we end up taking a sample, which is a portion of the population. And we have to recognize when we have a portion, when we have the whole thing, and there are in fact different calculations depending on what we have. There are actually a number of ways of sampling. What I'm going to do is just list off some of those sampling methods now. We're not going to talk about them in detail now. That's going to be a little bit later in the class, but I do want to actually mention what they are. Here's a basic list. Simple, random, stratified, systematic, cluster sampling, and convenience sampling are all methods that we will talk about at some future time. We also have another possibility for sampling, and that's simulation. This is something that has come into practice with the advent of computers. We could flip a coin, 100 times, 1,000 times as a sample, or we could write a program that simulates the flipping of the coin and will generate the sample much more quickly for us. So this is another method which is used to create sample data. The last and quite important discussion is the difference between descriptive stats and inferential stats. Usually, and this is how this course is set up, we're going to start off with descriptive stats. With descriptive stats, this involves organizing data, picturing data. This is creating a variety of graphs so that we can visualize what the data looks like. And summarizing data. This is where the calculations involved. This is like mean, median, and mode, standard deviation, all of the summarizing calculations about central tendency and variation is part of summarizing, which is different than inferential stats. Inferential stats is involved in using a sample to draw a conclusion or to infer from that sample something about the entire population. This actually is much more interesting, right, than I find than the descriptive stats. This is kind of the basic structure. And then if we have a sample of the human population, for example, what can we say about the entire population? Because again, it's going to be very difficult to measure the entire population. So all we have is the sample. So the sample will be different, but different in possibly predictable ways. And so this is where we get into a lot of probability and sort of combine probability with descriptive stats to infer something about the whole population.